again, and welcome back, or welcome to those of you who have just arrived. I'm Avery Gordon, a member of the Managing Editorial Committee of Race and Class, and I'm pleased to be the chair of this panel on radical internationalism and shifts in the global order. So I have actually been asked to speak for a few minutes to introduce the panel and the speaker, so I'm going to do that. Ending with the introduction of the other panelists. So let's get started. The Institute of Race Relations has, I think you might have gotten a sense from this from the last panel, always tried to take the diagnostic measure of the world we're living in at any given moment. That's what that phrase, to catch history on the wing, sort of means. Whether that be in the work of the journal, the research reports, the news bulletins, or the engagement with campaigns and grassroots groups. And it's always taken this measure with a keen eye to seeing the big picture and its historical origins, but from the vantage point of the most aggrieved, exploited, and taxed. And in this way, its understanding of racial capitalism and imperialism has been grounded in a moral compass that privileges the many over the few and has been intimately tied to the struggles, some large, some small, to really abolish this impossible way of life and create a more sustainable and livable one. And in my opinion, it's one of the Institute's greatest legacies. And it's both worth celebrating and also maintaining as we're here to mark the 50th anniversary of the IRR. And it's also then the standpoint that this particular panel on the new global order departs. So how to take that measure today? I think it's fair to say that we are living through a shift in the global order that has been dominated first by Europe and then the United States. And the signs of this shift that are, of course, of an unknown duration are many, and their meaning requires, I think, a kind of ongoing and nimble analysis, which I'm not going to provide. I'm just going to schematically mention some of those signs. And the first one is, of course, recurring crises and instability in the capitalist economy that are experienced on the one hand by elites as panic over the limits, ecological and otherwise, of the asset stripping strategies that have long enabled the extraction of great levels of wealth by the West, and experienced, on the other hand, by ordinary people as the limit of or the exhaustion with both austerity and also debt. So a nice slide that John showed you in the last session. Two, second sign, the proliferation of radical oppositions everywhere in every country, on every front, from large-scale rebellions to continuous strikes and protests, which heightened the sense of struggle, but also heightened the sense that the capitalist representative state cannot answer these demands and is being pushed to near collapse by the combined effect of capitalist crises and resurgent forms of authoritarianism, racist nationalism, and anti-democracy, forms which come as much from within the state as without. Third sign, frightening levels of money spent on militarization, securitization, and policing by so-called democratic countries to keep these failing systems afloat and to win what Trump called, but Biden's continued it, the great power competition. It's the US's post-global war on terror containment war against China and Russia's expansionist ambitions, a war to check the shifting of economic and geopolitical power east and to maintain US global dominance, a dominance which is challenged by the serious advance, although not complete at all, of the de-dollarization of international trade, with the Russia-Ukraine war has helped rather than hindered, challenged by the emergence of new political configurations and alliances, including the large numbers of Latin American countries joining both BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative, challenged by the reemergence of non-alignment as an anti-colonial principle for international conduct. And here it's notable that there were 17 African nations who abstained from the March 2nd UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, owing in large measure to their experience with both NATO and AFRICOM. So the decline of US global hegemony, the waning of the Eurocentric order doesn't, of course, mean that imperialism, racism, exploitation, indebtedness, or indenture is over. Things would be a lot simpler if we lived in that sort of Manichaean good, evil world of our favored literary and television fantasies. Unfortunately, we do not. We live in a world in which the wars the US wages with British and European support and doesn't win, which is every single one of them since World War II, have created partitions and unspeakable destruction. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, the Sahel, and now large parts of the Horn of Africa, particularly in Somalia. So there are really large questions that face us whose stakes are quite deep. How should we understand these signs and others I haven't mentioned? What do they mean at the global scale at which I've very schematically sketched them, and also at the local scale at which we live them with very different kind of density? What kinds of concepts and language do we need for understanding? Should we speak of imperialism or racial capitalism as singular world systems or of different types? How can we be accountable to the differential impacts of these crises and to the connected struggles in Britain, Europe, the Americas, Africa, and the whole of the very large space of Asia, from west to east? And most importantly for us today, what does it mean to be a radical internationalist in this context? From what experiences and traditions of struggle does one develop and articulate both the radicalism and the internationalism? How will each one develop and articulate, each one of us develop and articulate both the, how will each of us embody a solidarity that is a grammar both for fighting in fellowship with others all that we face and for instantiating the more equitable, peaceful, and sustainable life that we need? So that's a really tall order, and that this panel couldn't answer all these questions or cover all the topics and places that weren't our intention. And please do not hold the panelists responsible for the introduction that I have just given. That would be really unfair. They are each going to speak on the basis of their considerable experience and the important work that they've done as they see fit. And so, without further ado, let me introduce our fabulous speakers in the order in which they will speak. And if we have time, we'll try to have some Q&A after. So first, we're going to hear from Rafeef Ziadah, who is to my left, Palestinian-Canadian poet and human rights activist who teaches in the Department of International Development here at KCL. Her research focuses broadly on political economy, gender, and race, with a particular focus on the Middle East and East Africa. Rafeef has worked as an organizer with a number of refugee rights and anti-poverty groups, and is also the co-editor of a wonderful book called Revolutionary Feminisms from Verso. We will then hear from Akram Salhab, who is going to join us virtually, who is a PhD student in politics at Queen Mary, he's waving, who focuses on Palestinian history, sovereignty, and anti-colonialism. He's a longtime organizer for democratic rights in Palestine and for freedom of speech on Palestine at UK universities, including working to counter the impact of the Prevent legislation and the IHRA. And finally, we're going to hear from Liz Fekete, who is the director, as you know, of the Institute of Race Relations and head of its European research program. Her most recent book is entitled Europe's Fault Lines, Racism and the Rise of the Right, which won the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing in 2019. She's been involved with many anti-racist and anti-fascist campaigns for over 40 years. So, thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Rafeef.
Thank you very much for that brilliant introduction. How's everybody doing? All right, so I'm feeling the energy levels are a little bit low in the room, and if we're going to do some anti-racist organizing, I feel like our energy levels need to be higher. I was asked to speak about radical internationalism, which I will do, but I would like to start by doing a poem, if that was okay with everyone.
Yeah.
All right, let me just check. Is this working? Can I do it with this? All right. So I haven't performed in a while because of COVID, so please forgive me if I'm rusty. I wrote this poem when a young gentleman kicked me in the stomach and said, "You deserve to be raped before you have your terrorist children." I haven't had much time to work on the terrorist children. I've been busy with other things. But this is the poem. اسمحوا لي أن أتكلم بلساني العربي قبل أن يحتلوا لغتي أيضا. Allow me to speak my Arab tongue. Allow me to speak my Arab tongue before they occupy my language as well. Allow me to speak my mother tongue so her words can come through me before they colonize her memory as well. I am an Arab woman of color, and we come in all shades of anger. All my grandmother ever wanted to do was wake up at dawn and watch my grandfather kneel and pray in a village hidden between Yafa and Haifa. My mother was born under an olive tree on a soil they say is no longer mine, but I will cross their barriers, their checkpoints, their damn apartheid walls, and I'll return to my homeland. I am an Arab woman of color, and we come in all shades of anger. But you tell me this womb inside of me will only bring you your next terrorist, beard-wearing, gun-waving towel head. You tell me I send my children out to die, but those are your copters, your F-16s in our skies. And can we speak about this terrorism business for a second? Wasn't it the CIA that killed Allende and Lumumba? And who trained Osama in the first place? My grandparents didn't run around like clowns with white capes and white hoods on their heads, lynching black people. So let me break it to you. There is no good occupation and no moral army. I am an Arab woman of color, and we come in all shades of anger. So who's that brown woman screaming in a demonstration? Sorry, should I not scream? Did I forget to be your every Orientalist dream? Genie in a bottle, belly dancer, harem girl, soft-spoken Arab woman? Yes, master. No, master. Thank you for the peanut butter sandwiches raining down on us from your B-52s, master. Yes, my liberators are here to kill my children and call them collateral damage. I am an Arab woman of color, and we come in all shades of anger. So let me just tell you, this woman inside of me will only bring you your next rebel. She'll have a rock in one hand and a Palestinian flag in the other. I am an Arab woman of color. Beware, beware, beware our anger. That's more the energy I was hoping for. I'm glad we got there. I was asked to speak today about radical internationalism and shifts in the global political economy. So let me begin with Handala, my own anchor. Many of you might have seen Handala, the little cartoon of a Palestinian boy at the age of 10 turned around to the world. This is Najil Ali's cartoon. He drew this character, and this is what Najil Ali has to say about him. His name is Handala, and he has promised the people that he will remain true to himself. I drew him as a child who is not beautiful. His hair is like hedgehog who uses his thorns as a weapon. Handala is not a fat, happy, relaxed, or pampered child. He's barefooted like the refugee camp children, and he is an icon that protects me from making mistakes. Even though he is rough, he smells of amber. His hands are clasped behind his back as a sign of rejection at a time when solutions are presented to us in the American way. Handala was born 10 years old, and he will always be 10 years old. At that age, I left my homeland, and when he returns, Handala will still be 10, and he will start growing up. The laws of nature do not apply to him. He is unique. Things will become normal again when he returns to his homeland. He was the arrow of the compass pointing steadily towards Palestine, not just Palestine in geographical terms, but Palestine in a humanitarian sense, the symbol of a just cause, whether it is located in Egypt, in Vietnam, or in South Africa. I'm from Ain al-Hilwa, a camp like any other. The people of the camps were the people of the land in Palestine. They were not merchants or landowners. They were farmers. When they lost their land, they lost everything. The bourgeoisie did not know how we lived in the camps, how entire families died. Those are the Palestinians who remain in my mind. And when my work takes me away from the camp, they will always be in my mind. I wanted to give that extensive description of Hamdallah because I want to offer him as a compass for radical internationalism to everybody. Najil Ali, who drew Hamdallah, meant for him to be an anchor for people, a symbol of defiant bitterness. And it is okay to be bitter. If anything, the last 2 weeks in this country have made most of us even go beyond bitterness. But what is special about Hamdallah is that he is grounded in the camp, yet an understanding of his place and of justice that is well beyond the narrow alleys and walls of a refugee camp. So when I was asked to speak about the global political economy and the subject of multiple crises in the global south and issues with hegemony, the first thing that came to mind really was how a crisis like the crisis in Gaza, where rampant militarism, exploitation, underdevelopment really crystallized, with a place under siege for so many years, yet is only remembered when the bombs drop. That is when the world turns and names it a crisis. But the constant degradation of human life, the imprisonment of an entire population, the slow violence of settler colonialism is always constantly there in the background, but not remarked upon as a crisis. I say this because I want to argue that what flashes as moments of crisis on our screens has actually been the constant living conditions of the majority world. So I really want to admit I have become very fearful of the word crisis and all that it hides, the silences in between. I'm slightly tired of talking about crisis when it's only in the headlines, when we construct it as a refugee crisis, a cost of living crisis, an environmental crisis, when what we really mean to say is that there is a crisis of capitalism as an inhumane system that is destroying the planet. I want to start with this because we use the word crisis. We need to remember that these are actually very much man-made disasters, not random humanitarian accidents. Understanding them this way really helps us to tackle them at the root causes, not simply to hark back to a welfare state type Keynesianism within the borders of one state. We've spoken about neoliberalism today. But let me take a dig here at the welfare state as it existed and people harking back to that and nationalizing the rail, great, nationalize the rail. But please remember that during that time, exploitation still existed and there was only wealth in the global north because of the exploitation of the global south. We have to remember the words of Walter Rodney, that underdevelopment is dialectic and it means that there is development happening in another place. On the other hand, we need to remember that crises also ultimately present moments of extreme malleability and fluidity. They are frequently seized upon by capitalist states and powerful actors as opportunities to restructure. The Middle East is very well known for these moments of restructuring seen as opportunities. Remember, the invasion and destruction of Iraq was presented as an opportunity for neoliberalism in the region. But these opportunities are always moments of contestation as well. After the uprisings in the Middle East, this motif of crisis as opportunity was really heralded by international financial institutions. The World Bank actually said this is a moment for market solutions, and that the real problem in the Middle East is that we haven't had enough of free markets. So the articulation of crises, both in terms of how they are identified and defined, how they are potentially resolved, is a question always of contestation. There is nothing foreclosed about them, but we always have to have in the back of our minds that capital is really waiting for that opportunity to restructure very quickly. And nothing made this more blatantly obvious than the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic underscored the irrational nature of capitalist organization of public healthcare systems structured around corporate profit, the universal cutbacks to public hospital staffing and infrastructure, the lack of public health provision and access to medical services in many countries, and the ways in which property rights of pharmaceutical companies actually were valued over human life. What many people talked about in terms of a vaccine apartheid is actually how the global political economy is structured at its root. The pandemic very quickly put the spotlight on the social care systems and how they have been destroyed in the majority of the world. The relationship between public health and conditions of labor, precarity, and poverty. In countries where the majority of the labor force is engaged in informal work or depends upon unpredictable daily wages, this is the majority of the world, East and West Asia, Africa, Latin America, there is no feasible way that people could choose to stay home. Public health was intimately connected to how the majority of the world had become working poor. The pandemic also put the issue of displacement and refugees front and center, as millions of displaced people could not cope in overcrowded refugee camps and overcrowded urban spaces that lacked the very rudimentary basics of health, and were only allowed access to it under this guise of citizenship, a word that can dictate whether we are considered humans or not at borders. The social conditions that existed in the Global South are the direct product of how these states have been inserted into the hierarchies of the world market through the violence of Western colonialism, which has continued into contemporary times with the subordination of poor countries to the interests of the world's wealthiest states and largest transnational corporations. I was telling John, I was very thankful he used the word imperialism over and over. It's a word that has come out of fashion, but I think we really need to bring it back into fashion because we cannot explain how the world is functioning today without this question of imperialism. Again, as Walter Rodney writes so eloquently, it is necessary to emphasize that development and underdevelopment are not comparative terms, but they're also dialectical relationship, one to the other. This is to say, the two help produce each other by interaction. The policies that have existed for some time now, that have shaped how the Global South has been able to act within the pandemic and beyond, have been, as most of you know, the package of neoliberal policies around the privatization of private sector growth, fiscal austerity, cuts to subsidies, trade liberalization, opening up to foreign capital flows, export-oriented and import-dependent agriculture. And when we speak about agriculture, this moment of how many people are not going to have food because of the way the food system is structured internationally, and that merits its own conversation about the structure of our food production and how racialized it is, directly impacts people in the Global South. Because of the structures of the global economy, things like we see as inflation here do trickle down. That is trickle-down economics. It's the hardships that trickle down, not all the money that is constantly trickling up. Foregrounding these historical and international dimensions helps to ground us in a radical internationalism that takes into account colonialism and neocolonialism, making clear the enormous scale that the crisis is global. In this sense, I do want to make a very short and friendly amendment, if I may, to Siva's very important quote, "We are here because you were there." As somebody who studies English as a second language, allow me to add a present tense to that sentence. We are here because they continue to be there, and they never left in the first place. But it's also very critical that we not flatten out the Global South. These economic shifts that have generated extreme disparities in wealth, in ownership, and in control, access to resources and access to the market and access to political power. We cannot consider the Global South as one flat area where everybody has equal power. On one side, there's a very tiny layer of these populations that have benefited enormously with privatization and new market opportunities. And of course, their connections to the military elites, and military trade internationally. We have to remember this, that our radical internationalism should also not be a critical knee-jerk support of regimes that happen to use anti-Western rhetoric. And on this note, I'm constantly reminded by Layla Shami's incredible essay, "We don't need an anti-imperialism of idiots. We need a critical anti-imperialism." And on this note, I want to give a shout out to my sisters, Kurdish sisters and Iranian sisters who have been standing up to the Iranian regime for the past weeks. So when speaking of radical internationalism, and I will end on this point, I really want to center the global nature of capitalism, linking questions such as the abolition of third world debt, an end to the IMF and World Bank neoliberal structural adjustment packages, reparations for colonialism, which we always have to put front and center, and a halt to the global arms trade and prison abolition. These are not separate issues that we can all organize in separate spaces. And I recognize that sometimes in campaigning, and I've been an activist for a very long time, you need to prioritize, you need to pick a campaign. But at what point we have to all come together and say these things are interconnected and we cannot fight them separately from one another. Global debt, structural adjustment programs, reparations for colonialism is a necessity that we always have to put on the table. And the global arms trade, especially as we live in a country that benefits hugely from the arms trade. It might have been Saudi Arabia that destroyed Yemen, but it was arms purchased from this country, logistical support from this country that helped to destroy Yemen, and we always have to foreground that in our work. So let me end with Hamdallah again. Hamdallah may not be your compass, but we all need a compass. And in that sense, I'm extremely thankful for the Institute of Race Relations and for the journal Race and Class, because for many of us who are first generation coming to academia at all, or to writing, or even to politics, it was the space where we learned to find our own voice. And spaces that teach you how to find your own voice are really the true spirit of radical internationalism. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Akram, you're on now.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Avery, and for the brilliant setting up of the questions we want to speak about today from you, Rafeef, and obviously for the IIR for organizing today's event. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. The fact that I'm on a huge screen behind you, I feel extra responsible and to bring forth some of the issues that I think are really important. And for me, what set and has always set the IIR apart from other organizations as a young organizer unfamiliar with the scene in London was the fact that IIR would always keep this element of internationalism as part, the crossover between anti-racism, colonialism, and the struggle against them being unified on all fronts was something that many of us have learned from Sivanandan, or at least has been articulated very strongly in Sivanandan. And it's important that, and crucial that the IIR is continuing to do this really important work, especially as so much of anti-racist work begins to be fragmented along lines of identity politics, individual definitions, and separating international struggle from anti-racism as though it can be dealt with through trainings and you know, minor things that seek to amend individual instances of racism but don't deal with the broader structures. And I think, you know, for me, after the events of 2 years ago and seeing the response to Black Lives Matter, much of what I saw really reflected what I'd been reading in Sivanandan's writings on the RAT trainings and other elements of the way that the system seeks to respond to the challenge that's presented to it and to de-radicalize and weaken the struggles that are trying to pose serious questions to the structure of the society that we're living in. And I think the question of internationalism is one that I would really like to locate in the question of what we do about it. So for many of us, arriving in London actually offers us a huge opportunity to begin to think again about how internationalism is born, what ideologies, where ideologies are created, and what role we can play in producing bonds between our communities that can seek to strengthen each of our struggles. Many of us who've been involved in Palestine work for a very long time will probably be sick of rehearsing the same language over and over again. We understand our rights, we understand the importance of international law, we understand the importance of the UN, we understand the gains of the Palestinian revolutionary struggle and bringing them forward. But appeals to the West become more and feel year on year less and less effective, as we see that many of the societies that we're part of we're reminded that much of what Israel does to Palestinians was learned from British colonial policy. Much of that British colonial policy is now being reflected back in the way that Britain treats its minority communities, as it calls us, and the way that it deals with attempts to organize liberation struggles, the way it harasses activists, the ways it seeks to limit what we can say, or the ways in which we know through Prevent, IHRA seeks to exclude supporters of Palestine and many other causes from the public sphere. So I think with that in mind, one of the questions that many people have come to ask is, what can we do amongst ourselves that can begin to rebuild a radical internationalism? And this is where I'm going to suddenly refer to what I had actually written down, which is so in September 2019, there was a really amazing event that a few of us organized at the edge of the Labour Party conference that the world transformed. And one of the larger tents, there were speakers from a number of different liberation struggles and migrant groups talking about the struggles that had come to prominence that year, sharing their experiences, explaining their movement's demands, and making links with other struggles taking place in other countries around the world. And that year was one in which the world was lit up by the beauty of the revolution in Sudan, a revolution led by women whose chants were carried around the world, and which called for the end of the military regime. Many will remember these incredible protests, thousands of protesters coming into Khartoum on top of trains, the beautiful songs and chants expressing Sudan's aspirations for freedom, the brutal crackdown by the Transitional Military Council on June the 3rd. There were also enormous protests in Santiago, beginning around the fare hike in the metro, spreading to broader questions of women's liberation and neoliberalism in that country. In Algeria, there were huge protests, and they were followed by ones in Lebanon and Morocco. It was also the year that Bolsonaro came to power in Brazil, and there was quite a fierce reaction related to the rainforest and the indigenous people whose habitat he has done much to destroy. It was also the year that the Indian fascist BJP revoked Kashmir's special status and sent thousands of troops into Kashmir to preempt the re-emergence of the liberation campaign there. So at the event, we welcomed speakers from all these liberation struggles, revolutions and democracy movements in Kurdistan, Western Sahara, Palestine, West Papua, Brazil, Kashmir, Sudan, Eritrea, and elsewhere. And there was food and dance and presentations about our various struggles. And a number of those speakers spoke at the Labour Party conference from Yemen, from Palestine, from Kashmir, and Western Sahara again, talking about basic demands for our rights and our communities. And it was the first time that many of these things have been articulated in what was a semi-mainstream forum. And we saw how Jeremy Corbyn, in many ways, came to represent these demands for freedom were dealt with, and our struggles cast as racist by some, or as a distraction from the real bread and butter issues of governing. And you remember, there was a picture of Jeremy Corbyn, and underneath he was wearing a Western Saharan Solidarity t-shirt, and people were ridiculing him. Why does he care about this? As though anything which involves people, issues outside of Britain, are somehow a distraction from the real issues that we should be focusing on. So, and what struck me is that event was also one of many occasions that these different movements had met that year, because when the protests were taking place, they were meeting in Trafalgar Square. And these kind of fleeting encounters between different groups and liberation movements gave a sense of the kinds of ways in which these interactions had begun, but need to be solidified and turned into a more concrete plan of action about how we push forward and how we organize together. So with that in mind, there's really a few points I want to make about what we need in order to take this forward. It doesn't suffice to have these encounters on panels in passing in this way. It really requires us to think about the kinds of structures, organizations of which IRR is one, initiatives that we can begin to bring together different groups to have a serious discussion about the histories that we share, the histories that we don't share, and what kinds of initiatives we can do to take forward, we can do taking forward together. And I think as someone who is now obviously a researcher working on my PhD, I've begun to read lots of these micro histories of cities between the world wars and the importance of shared space in creating this third world ideology. The fact that London is one of the most diverse places you could possibly live and is a place where many exiles, intellectuals, students, movements, and others are based, mean that anyone in the city or in Britain more broadly, but particularly in London, has a real opportunity to engage in building the kind of politics that we want to see. And I think that the challenge that presents is that we have to take seriously this idea of what ideology, what shared principles, and what shared ideas do we want to bring together. Rafeef was talking about the Kurdish struggle and the women's struggle in Iran at the moment. Of course, that's an object lesson of the kinds of challenges that are thrown up between Palestinian and Kurdish communities. On the one hand, Palestinians are given the modicum of support by Turkey, and we're told that although it's a NATO ally and has a military alliance and extensive economic and whatever relations, but their leader has said a few words against Israel, therefore that's the extent of the solidarity that we can expect, forgetting that we have a whole history of joint struggle with parts of the Kurdish movement. And then many Palestinians believe things about Kurds which aren't true, and Kurds believe many things about Palestinians which aren't true. And these divisions are created in order to separate and weaken our different struggles. In fact, there's enormous scope built on this joint history where we can begin to understand that actually there were similar predicaments that were discussed back in the day, that there are similar predicaments today, and that the counter-hegemonic force that we want to develop begins by retrieving these traditions of struggle. And how that's done in a serious way, I think, is something that everyone really needs to think about, especially, as I said, located in London as we are. There's quite a few examples of that. One of which was CAMPAC, which is a campaign against criminalizing communities, which the IRR, I believe, was involved in at its initiation in 2003, against introduction of anti-terror legislation. There's the point that Rafeef made about reparations. You know, there's a very active campaign by some in the Indian community about the Amritsar massacre, which took place. Well, obviously, Palestinians are very active on the Balfour campaign, seeking reparations for Britain's role in our country. There's many others, but these campaigns will always strengthen if we can find ways to unify these demands rather than say these are just separate demands made by Kenyans, made by Palestinians, made by others, but actually that there's a common history of colonialism that we can build around. And I think that's where we need to take seriously, you know, we also need to take seriously this element that we are here part of, we are here because you were there or because you are still there. And I think what a lot of people are learning now, especially with the events that took place in Leicester, is that there's nothing about our subjectivity as Black or brown or minority communities which inherently brings us together. But the anti-colonial tradition on which we're seeking to build was built on one of common principles. And, you know, Sivanandan writes about this a lot, which is that all the anti-racist work that was done, which is bringing communities together here, benefited from the fact there was a global revolution taking place, which informed it, which connected to it, and which kept that tradition very live and active. And I think our job today is to think about where are we in that current global situation, and where can we begin to build from? And I think a lot of that work can actually be done in the location we found ourselves in London, finding other movements, finding solidarity groupings, having serious engagement with people, finding other organizations we can build with. And I think that's where we can begin to respond to some of these questions about building a radical internationalism, because these attempts to focus on Parliament, every time we have a discussion on Palestine now about lobbying Parliament, who can we speak to and what can we do, we've really hit a brick wall. So we have to go back to basics, we'll go back to our communities and begin to build from the grassroots upwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you, Avery. It's been amazing so far. Oh, hope I don't spoil it. I've chosen to speak about Eurocentrism and the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But before I start, I'd just like you all to eavesdrop onto a conversation that I was having with Barbara Ransby over there yesterday about Siva, because I'd like to say a few words about Siva. And Barbara asked me, do you miss him? How's it been since he died? Do you miss him? And I wasn't happy, Barbara, with how I responded to that. And afterwards, I was thinking, when I couldn't sleep last night because I was so nervous about preparing for this, I was thinking what I really wanted to say was that there's missing and there's non-missing. And yes, I miss his physical presence, but you know what? His voice is there. Orally, his voice is still there. And, that's not an easy thing sometimes, because he's always nagging me. He is always scolding me. Everyone who knows him laughed at that point. And one of the things that he would always scold about us is that he'd say, don't go on the old track lines. Look at the world anew. What's new? Look at the empirical evidence in front of you. Be better at handling contradictions, the internal and external dynamics of things. So that's kind of an introduction to the difficult things that I want to say about contradictions in this conflict. An international perspective, an internationalist perspective on the war in Ukraine has been missing. And Eurocentrist civilizational frameworks are disappearing the experiences of the global south, of Western imperialisms. The charge of whataboutism and camp politics against those who seek to address the relationship between Russian imperialism and Western imperialism is in danger of becoming a kind of form of policing of progressive ideas. You know what? The world doesn't exist in boxes. There isn't Russian imperialism there and Western imperialism there. There is a dynamic between them, and they are feeding off each other. So I want to say a few words first about Eurocentrism. There are at least 23 armed conflicts raging across the world. Yet only one conflict is reported on daily in the British press. It's a serious conflict. No one's saying that, and it's threatening, its ramifications are global. However, that was true on day one of the conflict. A Telegraph journalist stated that they seem so like us. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations. It can happen to anyone. Ukraine's former Deputy General Prosecutor spoke on BBC of his emotions at seeing European people with blonde hair and blue eyes being killed. For those of us who aspire to connect with the radical internationalist tradition, internationalism and Eurocentrism are incompatible. So I'd like to say now a few words about mystifying clash of civilizational frameworks. I think what we've seen as the war has developed is the reworking of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, made popular during the War on Terror. Of course, the binary then was the West versus Islam, and now it's Russia versus the West. Of course, when Russia invaded, Russia started this war, it's quite clear that for the Ukrainian resistance, stubborn, brave, heroic resistance, that this was an existential fight to retain their sovereignty. However, as the war progressed, we began to see this civilizational framework cemented on both sides. So in Western discourse, Russia is presented as an evil empire or a plague, and the sole face of imperialism today. I don't know which of the previous speakers said that we need to bring imperialism back, but in the discourse, imperialism is back. Russian imperialism is presented as the sole force of imperialism today. But from the other perspective, Putin is also very good at using civilizational frameworks. And he's actually, despite being an anti-communist, despite his criticisms of the Soviet Union, he's very good, magpie-like, picking on those aspects of the Soviet Union where he wants to. So in one of his later speeches, he presented Russia as the defender of the global South against US neo-colonialism, targeting also a decadent West that has abandoned religion and embraced Satanism. Right, okay. So what I'm saying is that this framework, we've got to do everything we can to reject this framework because it's a mystification and it's obscuring the dynamics of imperialism today. I feel that what has developed is not a clash of civilizations, but a clash of imperialisms. And what's dangerous is within civilizational frameworks is the absolutism that develops. If it is a clash, a civilizational clash, that makes it a sacred war, a sacred fight against something that will ultimately destroy us. And that means the only solution can be on the battlefield, with military humiliation for one side and complete victory for another. At the same time, as I mentioned before, I see a similarity in the logic of a war on terror in the isolating techniques and censorship deployed against all those who make the slightest attempt to analyse the causes of the war or its consequences. Any warning that an entirely military approach to the war that rules out negotiations, any criticism of NATO is now regarded as appeasement, or, in the case of the British Labour Party, a case for expulsion. But as Professor Gerard Toll has warned us, the idea that restraint is weakness leads us ever closer to the use of nuclear weapons. I want to talk now briefly about understanding the dynamics between Russian imperialism and US imperialism, the differences and the similarities. So I also want to do is address the consequences of civilizational racism, by which I mean the language of superior and lesser races is replaced with a hierarchy of civilizations, with nations ranked according to adherence to Western values. So Russian imperialism, as far as I understand it, and we are catching up fast, so I can't pretend that I have an expert knowledge of this, but it seems to me that what Putin seeks to challenge is the US-dominated world, and he's trying to seek imperial domination over post-Soviet space. And so it's also linked to the way that Russia has shrunk. It's actually the smallest since it was since the 17th century, and considerably smaller than it was at the beginning of World War I. Of course, that is perceived and used by Putin, whose imperialism, far from mirroring US imperialism, is a more reactionary, revanchist attempts to return to the Tsarist Empire, which would include Ukraine. So how is that different from US imperialism? I'm beginning to think I've run out the wrong thing here. No, it's fine. So, okay, if we look at American imperialism, we can see that it is still the predominant economic power in the world. I'm not quite sure in the way that we actually presented this session in the material before, where we talked about Western decline. I'm not sure, to be honest, of US decline. America has 750 foreign military bases spread out across 80 countries. Russia has 24 bases. America benefits from the global dollar system, has dominance of world trade. And also, I got a shock when I realized this, 25% of the world now exists under a unilateral US sanctions regime, bringing starvation, early death, and other miseries as heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is what I think are the differences that we need to analyse. But there's also something else that we need to analyse, which is the way that imperialism today, or imperialisms today, interact with Central and European nationalisms. And what is the nature of that nationalism? And it's very, very difficult to talk about this at the moment. You know, nobody wants to draw attention at a time of courageous resistance to the Russian offensive to the dangers of nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe, including in Ukraine. Not of the Ukrainian people, but of its ruling Servants of People's Party. And I think one way that we can get around this, it's quite possible to critique Ukrainian nationalism if we don't exceptionalize it, but analyze it in the context of the extreme nationalism that has taken root in Central and Eastern European region as a whole. Of course, that is also linked to Russian aggression, Russian expansionism, and aggressions towards its neighbours, which reinforces that nationalism. But there is an internal dynamic to that nationalism that we need to urgently address. And also, I think, you know, when some of us at the start of the war were trying to draw attention to the whole incorporation into the Ukrainian National Guard of a white supremacist and neo-Nazi battalion. It was like, don't talk about that now. We can talk about that after the war. But you know what? And of course there are neo-Nazis on the Russian side, and there's the Wagner group, but it's Ukraine that is applying to join NATO and is applying to join the EU. And also, I just want to say here that there is powerful resistance to all this in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, where opposition has been quite inspirational. However, mainstream nationalism across that region is not emancipatory or anti-racist at all. It is deeply reactionary and racist. And just as internationalism and Eurocentrism are incompatible, so too is internationalism and ethnic nationalism. And there's a group, I can't go into it, I won't have long, but there's a website that I would urge you all to look at called Defending History, which documents the way, it's been going for a long time, but it documents the way Eastern European states have been attempting to rewrite the history of the Second World War. Lost my space. Okay, so in this bit of what I'm going to say, I want to talk about how the region is deepening Eurocentrism. There is an openness within mainstream nationalism across that region to a rewriting of the history of that region's collaboration with the Holocaust. And I mean, I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this is mainstream. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian nationalist Stefan Bandera, who collaborated with the Nazis and included in the Holocaust, is venerated as a national hero. And in Lithuania, Jonas Narelko, who signed deportation orders for Jews and has been declared a national hero. And the whole thinking of this is around the idea of what's called the double genocide. so that Soviet crimes and Holocaust and Nazi crimes are treated within that thinking as equal, but at the same time, it's actually the crimes of the Soviet Union that are emphasised. So I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to smash on, and I'm not going to say some of the things that I wanted to say about the nationalism. I will actually just say that in 2013, several conservatives and far-right parties signed the Bosca Declaration, which called on the world to fight Russian imperialism, as well as multiculturalism, cultural Marxism, and globalism. And one of the signatories' ideologues said the basics of Estonian immigration policy should be, are you black? Then go back to where you come from, and that Estonia should remain a white country. There's a lot that I could say here about the civilizational racism at our borders and what has happened. It's become very, very clear that there are two different borders now, particularly obviously in the countries bordering Belarus and Russia. So there's a civilizational racism at the border, which distinguishes between refugees coming via Belarus from the Middle East and Russia and refugees coming from Ukraine. None of this is the fault of Ukrainian refugees who are benefiting from a temporary protection directive, but still suffer from xenoracism in Europe. So I want to conclude with some observations coming from the Global South. Sorry, just finding my place. Bear with me. I'll have to remember this. Anyway, as I said at the beginning, on all this, the Global South has been disappeared. And yet it's from the Global South that the most holistic understanding of this dynamics between different imperialism is emerging. The Global South experience of communism was different from that of the Soviet republics. So let me end with a few examples from their experience. At the recent UN General Assembly, which foregrounded the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the representatives of Cuba, Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, Gabon, Dominica, Bolivia, Argentina, etc., 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 in upholding the right to self-determination of all nations, made a point of calling for an end to the cruel and illegal American blockade of Cuba. Others draw from their own experience of colonialism to speak out against Russian imperialism, as well as to provide a roadmap for peace and security. An editorial in the Jakarta Times declared that though the circumstances are different, the Russians are repeating Indonesia's colonial-style blunder when it invaded East Timor, now Timor-Leste, in 1975. There's a very important piece by University of Haifa Professor Asad Ghanem, who called out President Zelensky for his comments identifying with Israel and saying that Israel faced the same existential threat as Ukrainians. And Asad Ghanem condemned Zelensky for putting reality on its head between oppressed and oppressor. And he lauded the Ukrainian people's stubborn struggles, but wrote that Palestinians know that a Russian victory would be a great gift to Israel's Iron Wall concept, which regulates Israel's dealing with Palestinians until Palestinians' complete defeat. The African Union has repeatedly spoken out, saying that the continent has suffered enough of the burden of history. Africa does not want to become the breeding ground of a new Cold War. In all these ways and all these examples, Russian and Western imperialism understood in concert as a joint threat to the world. It seems to me that we can be against Russian and Western imperialism at the same time. We don't need to resort to the language of barbarianism, plagues, and civilizational threat. We must support the African Union in its plea to bring an end to this conflict, and we must do more to combat the 23 wars raging across the world. Peace, security, and self-determination for all those living under occupation.